Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a sort of an online panel hosted by APS DBIO, but we're not going to be talking so much specifically about biophysics, more about uh, broadly physics and perhaps even more broadly science, um, and what we can do to use our voices to help science in this kind of critical time. Um, so the way that we're going to organize this is I'm going to start by sharing just a couple of slides, summarizing uh, some of the sort of difficulties we're dealing with as a science community right now, um, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it's I think useful to see it in one place. And then we'll introduce the panel and we'll discuss uh, um, why it's so important to stand up for science right now, and try to think about some specific actions that we can take as individuals and as communities to to stand up for science. And then there will be time at the end for questions. So the goal will be to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions, ideally for about the last 10 minutes. I mean the last 20 minutes. Um, so with that, let me briefly share my screen. Okay. So I wanted to start. I mean, I've broken up. There's only two slides here, and the first slide is about science funding. So science funding is not the only thing that we'll talk about today, but it is one of the major things that we'll talk about today. So as many of you know, without funding, we can't have science. We can't hire students and postdocs, and science will not get done. There's actually kind of multiple different ways in which science funding is being attacked right now, and I think often they're like I'll just coarse grain all of this into one ugly lump in my head, but actually there's distinct things that are going on. And I think it's important to understand the distinctions. So, so one of the major things is the upcoming budget that Congress is still working on. So what typically happens is the president proposes a budget to Congress, and then Congress doesn't necessarily have to go along with the president's recommendation, but eventually they have to come up with a budget for 2026. And that includes how much money is allocated for all of the research funding organizations. So NSF, NIH, DOE, DOD. Um, and so the president has put out his proposal, which would mean a $20 billion cut to the NIH, which is about 44% cut, $5 billion cut to the NSF, which would be about a 55% cut to 2025's funding. A $1 billion cut to DOE Office of Science, which is like 14% decrease. And so all of this is under the budget that Congress has to approve. Now, entirely separately from that, there is, as part of this big beautiful bill, is, well, what if that's what they're calling it? There's a proposal to increase tax on endowments up to 21%. So it'll be graded based on I think it's graded based on the endowment, the size of the endowment per student, I believe, at a given private university. For context, I think current tax on endowment is around 1%. So for big universities with large endowments, this will be like a 2000% increase. And I mean, what this would mean, I can speak briefly about what this might mean for universities, but the income on endowments is used to pay for all sorts of things that just keep the university running. It pays for financial aid, it pays for buildings, it pays for startup packages for young professors, it pays for all sorts of things, uh, um, like postdoc fellows, many things. So entirely separately from those, oh, and I should say, so this bill has been passed in the House. It's in the Senate right now. Their stated goal is to have it passed by the 4th of July. Um, there's been a lot of hubbub about this bill recently I mean, I don't know if you followed all the stuff with Musk and Trump on Twitter, but there's people are really I mean, people on multiple sides are upset about this bill, but part that they're not really talking about is this tax on universities. What's really being spoken about is this the basically the increase in the U.S. Deficit. But as a small part of this giant kind of ugly thing, is this huge increase on university endowments. So then, independent of these first two things, the budget and also this big bill, there's a third thing, which is that the president and his administration is attempting to cut indirect costs at all of these federal agencies. So kind of trying to cut indirect costs to 15% across the board. At the NIH and the DOE, this has been blocked by judges, at least temporarily. I don't know actually the current status of the NSF and DoD. Uh, um, I don't know if anyone else knows the latest on that, but they're basically trying to cut indirect costs across the board to 15%. And again, for context, typical indirect costs on grants ranges anywhere from like 40 to 65%. So this is a huge cut. Um, uh, and on top, independent of these first three things, this is all proposed for future cuts to science funding. If you look on the right, already, even though the budget for 2025 was allocated last year for example, for the NSF, we're already seeing decreases in grants going out. So this is even before the budget of the NSF has been cut. We're seeing roughly a 50% decrease in the number of grants going out relative to like last year, even though the budget is the same, because the budget are roughly the same because it was approved last year. And you'll see at the bottom, so this is NSF data. There's similar data for NIH. And if you look at the bottom, you can see at the NSF what fields are being impacted most heavily. And it's the hard sciences, math, physics, chemistry. And I didn't include it here, but if you can actually zoom in on, there's a great New York Times article on this that I can link in the chat at the end, where they have some really nice graphics on this. And if you look at physics funding from the NSF specifically to date, it's down 85% over last year, which is one of the bigger ones that I saw in their graphic. So this is all science funding, but in addition to science funding, there's also sort of effects on the broader landscape of science in America. So we know that international students are being attacked in many ways. So there's visas being revoked. It was recently stated that new visa interviews are being halted. I don't know what the current status is on that. I don't know if that halt has been lifted. Yeah, it hasn't been lifted. There's been specific attacks on Chinese students. So they're saying that they're going to just start revoking the visas of Chinese students, particularly in quote unquote critical fields, which I assume includes physics. Uh, they're raiding dorms, they're arresting green card holders. They attempted to block Harvard's ability to even have international students. That block has been blocked by a judge temporarily. So we'll see what happens there. So these are all attacks on our international colleagues. And then even beyond that, sort of more generally, there are large organizational changes and attacks on academic freedoms. So thousands of federal employees have been fired at different academic agencies. There are big reorganizations that have been proposed to the NSF and NIH. And quite concerningly, a lot of these reorganizations involve or include political appointments. So there will be many of the proposals will have political appointees in charge of deciding which grants get funded. There have been cancellations of grants that have anything to do with diversity or DEI or even climate change or meant for many other reasons. And then we know that there are specific attacks on like Harvard and Columbia. And just recently, I mean, RFK just fired all of the scientists on the Vaccine Advisory Council. So this was just my attempt to try to summarize some of the major sort of attacks, as I see it, on science in America. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just wanted to put that in one organized place to set the stage for our conversation. Um, so with that, I wanted to introduce our panel, or have our panelists introduce themselves. Maybe if each of the panelists can say their name and what university you're at, and also what you work on in good times when you're thinking about exciting science. So Andrea, you want to
Call
start?
on us, Chris. Okay, great.
Oh, or Andy. Yeah.
Go ahead, Andy.
Okay, I'm Andrew Leifer. I'm an associate professor in physics and neuroscience at Princeton. Um, I'm an experimentalist. I'm interested in making measurements on neural networks, and particularly I study this worm C. elegans, and I measure and manipulate neural activity to try to understand how the brain processes information and generates actions.
Okay. I'm Andrea Liu. I'm a soft and living matter theorist from the University of Pennsylvania. Um, well, I've been working on this idea of tunable matter. That, for example, in the Hopfield model, you have tunable interactions between between physical degrees of freedom. Um, in such systems, that's how you develop complex functionality. So we're thinking about a wide variety of systems, including biological systems that way.
And I'm Sidney Nagel from the University of Chicago in the physics department and the Jane Frank Institute. I'm also a soft matter physicist, worked for many years with Andrea on a variety of topics, but I'm really an experimentalist, and my lab works on things having to do with glasses disorder and things having to do with fluids.
Very cool. Yeah, and I guess maybe I should introduce myself briefly because I don't think I did I did before. I'm Chris Lynn. I'm an assistant professor at Yale in physics and the Quantitative Biology Institute. What I really like to think about is I guess you could term the statistical mechanics of the brain. So how do we start with simple interactions and then at large scales get really interesting emergent behavior? Um, uh, Awesome. Well, now that we know everyone, I'll mention this again. I mentioned it before, but a lot of the conversation we're gonna have was sort of inspired by an article that Andy and Andrea and Sid wrote in Nature. You should be able to see it there should be a link to it in the chat if you'd like to read it now or later. But it will do a good job of summarizing a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Um, so to
I'll
kick
just put
things
it in
off,
again for people arriving.
yeah, that would be really helpful because I don't know if they can see this.
Oh, that's the wrong one.
Yeah, I think Andrew's gonna put it in again. Um,
There.
yeah, so to begin, I think it would be helpful to set the context about uh how attacks on science perhaps have happened in the past and how this relates to previous um, sort of, yeah, previous things that we've seen in a historical context. Um, so I want to know if y'all have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
Andy, do you want to start with that? I mean, put everything in
Sure,
context. One thing is,
sure.
are we sure that the attendance wasn't capped at 40?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hope not.
Okay. But
Well,
okay.
did you want to start, Andrea, or did you want me
No,
to?
no, okay, why don't you can start by,
Okay,
put
well, I mean, I think one
yeah.
of the things, Chris, as you were kind of enumerating some of the attacks we're seeing both on the funding and on the broader assaults on science and then our independent scientific research institutions, I think it's important mentioning that there's kind of a broader context here. I mean, I think one thing going on is that for whatever reason, this administration is not certainly valuing science research, but there's a broader thing going on about attacking independent civil society institutions. And so some of what we're seeing is part of this kind of playbook from authoritarian leaders that try to take down independent pillars of power that might act as a bulwark to their place in society. And so the universities and the kind of independent research ecosystem is one of those kind of independent sources of knowledge, and that can be inconvenient to authoritarian regimes. And so part of what's going on is that our universities are being attacked, and our funding is being used as kind of leverage, as a lever to weaken these kind of independent institutions within civil society. And so, what we all do, I'm not used to really thinking about it because most of what we do is, our research, but 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 that's one of the ways we can think about what's going on. And so the first lever has been kind of, at Columbia and at Harvard and at other places, these targeted cancellations of grants. But then that's another framework to think about a lot of what else is going on. The tax on the endowment, these attacks on accreditation, restricting student visas, politicized legal investigations into various institutions. And so federal funding is kind of that first lever. And so as we think about what's going on, we need to be clamoring for our funding so we can do our science, but also think about it in the context of these other attacks. And so that's where I was going to start. And then maybe Andrea, you can talk. Did you want to talk about how historically scientists have had a hard time dealing with situations where they had to choose between funding and defending their independence?
Yeah, it's sort of sorry to say that, yeah, scientists haven't really covered themselves in glory in the past. So I just put a link in the chat to, what happened in Germany in the 1930s. So when the Nazis are taking control of universities, which again, that's part of that playbook that Andrew was just talking about. They started with Frankfurt University because it was the most liberal, and so this Nazi guy came and announced what's going to happen. We're going to fire the Jews. Blah, blah, blah. Now we're taking over, and everybody looked at the most famous person on the faculty. It was a meeting for all of the faculty, and everybody looked at the most famous one, who was this biochemist, physiologist, and a famous liberal. And he got up and he said, "So that's very interesting, sir, but what about our funding? Is our funding going to be okay?" And he said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. Funding will not be affected." He said, "Okay, thank you," and sat down. And that was the end. Okay. So it's really, really important for us not to just think about funding and to think about this broader context and defend our freedoms as well. Those freedoms are necessary for doing great science too.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good segue into sort of thinking about academic freedoms, and I wanted to get y'all's take on why can you put into words why academic freedom is so important? I know that we hold it self-evident often, but yeah, why to you is academic freedom so important?
So I think Lysenkoism is a good example, and I think Sidney, you should probably take some of this, but I can just retell that story. But kind of science, science can only thrive when you have when you can exist in an ecosystem where you can pursue these things that are when you pursue science in a way consistent with these values, that you have to have quest for truth, knowledge, and understanding of the world around us, right? But when if your academic freedoms are infringed upon, it can restrict what you're allowed to study. And you're already seeing that in some cases, like with mRNA research right now. And it can have very negative consequences for scientists. So one historical example comes from the Soviet Union and Lysenkoism. So under Stalin, There was this guy Lysenko. He was a scientist, but not very good one, and he didn't like Mendelian genetics, and so he convinced the Soviet politicos that Mendelian genetics was bourgeois and anti-Marxist, and therefore it shouldn't be allowed. And the net result was that not only was all books on Mendelian genetics like pulled from the libraries, but they also killed all the fly stocks across all the Soviet Unions, and some people were jailed, and it had really negative consequences, including, in the Stalinist regime, many of those jailed people did not live, and there were famines and such. So there are some extreme historical examples of where if you let the government meddle with definitions of science, like we saw in some of these executive orders about like the biological definition of sex or whatnot, that kind of path can have really big negative consequences in a big way. So that's kind of an extreme example. And maybe Sidney, you probably have some stronger.
No, I don't think I have better examples, but I guess the one thing that is different here than I just want to emphasize is that the government has always been able to set what the funding rates are for sciences, and that's their job. And if the government had decided in normal times to have tightened the belt or whatever, we would have lived with it, but wouldn't have liked it, but we could have lived with it. What is so different about this time and hasn't somehow quite been emphasized yet here is that this is not a question of just the funding being tightened, but that it's been specifically attached to restricting freedoms at the university. This restricting what we're allowed to think about and what subjects are to be investigated on a political basis, not on the question of what the science is. And we can always say some science is good or bad. We debate that all the time among ourselves, but it's a different thing when this is being brought to us by people who are not interested in the science, but for other exterior motives. So, the thing that I find so particularly upsetting about things is that if 5 years ago you had asked me, what is the most important thing that science has done for humankind, I would have said without question, vaccines. That would have been, and obviously that is what has been under attack. And one of the primary things, it's gotten into political fray. And so all of our normal arguments about how we're even going to argue for the value of science has gotten overturned by this. And that's something which isn't exactly answering your question, but it is the thing that I find so particularly perturbing about where things stand today.
Yeah. And I think with that, so I think we have covered quite well why this is such an important thing to be thinking about and why these attacks are so potentially devastating. And maybe it makes sense at this point to switch gears into to start thinking about what we can do to sort of use our voices to push against these forces.
Yeah, so I can take that. So I've got these slides. So first I want to talk about what the APS is doing. The APS has really stepped up beyond many professional societies. I'm very proud to be a member of the APS. So one thing that it's doing is it's fighting in the courts. So it's filing amicus briefs, against the firing of probational federal workers and also the one calling for reductions of force. The first one I think is now going to be going to the appeals court, and that they're going to file another suit there. Also filed an amicus brief to stop the suspensions of visas that was paused by the administration, but there's no doubt that it's coming back. that they'll come back. Um, it's reaching out to Congress. So there is this campaign, there's a letter signing campaign to Congress. And here's a QR code to that campaign, but you can also find it right from the APS homepage. And if you haven't done that already, please, it just takes a few minutes to participate in this letter signing campaign that's targeted to your representatives in Congress. They've also been conducting training for members on how to talk to congressional staffs and organizing local visits. So I know a bunch of people from Philadelphia have gone and done that. But, part of the problem is physicists alone are not enough. There are not enough physicists in a given district. They're also starting a pilot in South Dakota to mobilize, people in the mining and pharma to join. And I think a really important part of this is that it does take more than just physicists, and we need to reach out to other societies. And a lot of other societies, for example, the ACS, American Chemical Society, is the largest professional STEM society, and it's doing nothing. IEEE is also very large, and they're keeping their head down too. So if you know anybody who's a member of those other societies, please also try to get them to put pressure on their societies to join into this effort. The American Astronomical Union has, I think, taken a strong stance, and also the American Geophysical Union. Let's see what's next. Yeah, so here again is a link to our Nature op-ed piece. But there are lots of things that we can do, but we can do them more effectively if we do them together. Um, so, so one of the things that I did was I wrote a letter to the president of Penn that eventually 650 faculty signed on to. Um, and and that's a way to put pressure on your institution. Just doing it one by one doesn't do as much good as if many of them do it together. And in particular, there's this American Association of Colleges and Universities letter. I'll put the link in the chat later. That I think almost 700 institutions and organizations have signed, colleges and universities and professional societies have signed, but there are a few prominent omissions, like Stanford, University of Chicago, and Caltech. Putting pressure, especially on these schools, I think is important. Also pressuring them to take legal action to protect international scholars. I think that's incredibly important, but also funding. So Harvard filed a lawsuit to stop the funding cuts that were, leveled against it. Several universities have signed an amicus brief supporting it. I'm happy to say that Penn is one of them. And interestingly, also Princeton, Stanford, Yale, right, Chris? And Stanford and Caltech signed it, but the University of Chicago has not. So that's something to push for. Yeah, the thing about professional societies, I already said, but I think, if we could have really effective campaigns to Congress and to the public and to take legal actions where all the professional societies in STEM are working together, that would have a lot more impact. So, and I just end with this quote from Ben Franklin, the founder of my university, Penn: "We must all hang together or we will all hang separately." Just a couple other things you can do. You can join the mailing list for the Committee for Human Rights of the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine. I'm actually the vice chair. And they have this nice slide, which I show in all my talks. And you can get it from this website. But you can also ask me for it. of things that you can do to protect human rights right now. And then I just wanted to mention a few more things. Graduate student unions are very good at organizing actions, but they're tending to view their adversary as their university administration. But I think what's happening now from the Trump administration, it has the capacity to destroy an entire generation of researchers. It's really terrible for our graduate students right now. And the graduate students unions should be focusing on this. And it's not just science graduate students, okay? A lot of the money that supports graduate students in other fields comes from indirect costs, from grants. So, so this affects all graduate students, not just ones in science. So I think if you can mobilize the graduate student union at your university, that's something that could make a difference. The second thing is this Bethesda declaration. I have a QR code here. This was written by NIH staffers and talking about how what's being done to the NIH is how it's an attack on academic freedom, and it's politicizing science. There's now an open letter in support of this that anyone can sign. You do not have to be an NIH grant recipient. You do not have to be a scientist to sign this open letter of support. Let's see. I talked to an immigration lawyer recently. I'm worried about people in my group, particularly ones from China. And what this immigration lawyer suggested was really to run fire drills of what would happen if someone were picked up and detained and sent to someplace in Louisiana. What would happen if, someone's visa were revoked? What is the plan? And to really get every element of that plan into place. When people are being detained, they're not being read their Miranda rights. So it's really important. Everybody has Miranda rights, whether you're a citizen or not. Anybody who is in the United States at this moment, has Miranda rights. They're not reading them to people who are being detained. And so you have to know them. And one of them is that you have a right to call a lawyer. But that lawyer has to have paperwork to show that they are actually your lawyer. Okay, so this is something I think we should all be pushing on our Office of International Student Services that handles visas to make sure that they have step-by-step instructions on what to do so that we can run these fire drills. I'm about to write a letter basically to the one at Penn asking them to provide free legal aid to anyone who gets caught up in this. And I'm going to send it to the people who signed my previous letter. And I'm happy to share that letter with anyone. The Union of Concerned Scientists has been very active filing lawsuits and so forth, not just amicus briefs, but lawsuits. And the way to join is just to make a donation, which can be as large or small as you like. Let's see. Protest, right? There's one this Saturday, June 14th. They're big protests. You can get to it from the No Kings website, or also Stand Up for Science will take you to that protest as well, so you can find a place near you. Okay, Andy, do you want to add anything there?
I just want to add one thing, or maybe two things. So one is, I've been adding like a slide, kind of like the ones that Andrea has shown to my talks, to when I give science talks at institutions. And one of the questions I often get is, well, why are you telling us this? We're scientists, we already agree. Shouldn't you be out there talking on, I don't know, don't you have to go on Fox News or something? But I have two answers to that. One, but the biggest one is we have not, as a community, saturated what we can do to protect our international scholars who are targeted with visa revocations, or to speak out for the independence of other universities that are being attacked. And so I think there's a lot more we can do. And if you're like me, you're probably much more comfortable talking to your institutions and your professional societies. And so I think that's low-hanging fruit that we as a community can do a lot more to speak out. So yeah, that's what I wanted to make clear, that even that is worthwhile. And then if you want to do more, the protests I think are a great idea. There's my political science colleagues say, there's like there's empirical evidence that once you get a certain percentage of the population actually engaged in protest, there's a high chance that your movement will have major gains.
Cool.
So there's one other outfit which I've been hearing about, which is Stand Up for Science, which may also be a good one to participate in. I mean, the one comment I would make following what Andy just said, which is a very personal one, and I don't know if it's relevant to anyone else but me, but I mean, I feel very uncomfortable being up here. I mean, what do I know about any of this stuff? I'm not a policy wonk. I never was. I never cared about it. It wasn't what I do. And so what do I feel like? Well, this feels like what I've always been, which is it's the imposter syndrome all over again. That, just as in research, my dominant feelings were, do I know enough to contribute? Do I have anything to say that is worth hearing? If I open my mouth, will I be ridiculed and lose my career opportunities? These are the things that I felt all my life in doing science, and it's now coming up here. So do I know enough about politics, what's happening in the world, at universities, at labs? Hasn't it all been said already? What do I have new to offer? Will I make a fool of myself, lose even more funding if I say something stupid, which means in this case against the trend? And drawing attention to myself is always dangerous. I mean, and then the thing that's coming up now, which I find difficult to wrestle with, is are there truths behind the criticisms of academia, research, and science? The criticisms of academia, research, and science. Couldn't things indeed be better? And certainly they could be better. Nothing is perfect. And so the point is that, okay, the imposter syndrome is real, but it shouldn't dictate our actions. And we faced it in research. And for those of you who have it, which maybe some of you do, but just in research, your own experience gives you a valid and new perspective. Your comments are invariably add to the discussion. You'll, just as in research, you'll always be attacked by your opponents. And just as in research, which I find particularly valuable now, is that collaboration, dialogue, brings into focus new ideas and ways of thinking. And this allows you to work together, even though you have certain insecurities of your own. And then the final thing, which we've said, I think, before, is don't take the bait. Just because your work did not answer everything does not mean that it's not of extremely good value in and of itself. And so just as Andrea ended with her quote from Ben Franklin, there's a quote that's been attributed to Voltaire, but he got it from other places, I think, is the best is the enemy of the good. And so, yes, there are things that can be improved in the thing. And so we see all these editorials saying, this is bad, that's bad, and therefore shouldn't science go away for a while or whatever. But the point is that you don't burn down your house because the gutters need to be cleaned. I mean, there's the reaction is not proportional to what the things that you want to fix. And so, I think the university is a very, very, very precious commodity, and it's something that's under attack, and that we really have to work together to fight back.
Well, thank you all very much for sharing your perspectives. And I guess in the spirit of building a community and communicating with one another, I thought maybe we could open it up for for questions from the participants. So if anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to talk about, feel free to unmute yourself. Or I guess maybe we should raise our hand. Someone has their hand raised. Vernita.
Hi, so thank you all for being here and for your honest and vulnerable comments. And I have a question that I'm really ashamed of, but I'm just going to ask it anyhow. So I hear what you're saying, and when I think about other people doing these protests or engaging in these activities, I feel really excited. Like I'm really glad that people are doing this. When I think about doing these protests and writing and whatever activities myself, even to the extent of just showing slides in a talk, I feel very frightened because I'm at University of Texas. I absolutely do not believe that my institution would have my back. And UT is pretty under the thumb of the Texas legislature and the Texas governor, and tenure protections here are weaker than they are in any other place that I know of. So I guess my question is like, I'm really ashamed that I'm so afraid, but I have a very strong fear response right now. How do I deal with that?
First thing is, I think it's totally natural and reasonable and rational to be afraid. And I don't necessarily have a specific answer to that, but I will say one of the things that's on our list here that we didn't get to is that for those of us who are in more secure positions, I feel a very strong responsibility to speak out doubly on behalf of others. And so, maybe that's because your institution doesn't provide good protections or is in a politically charged environment, but that can also be because you're a green card holder or you're on a visa yourself, regardless of your institution. And so you really shouldn't in this environment speak out because they're targeting you. And so I feel like those of us who have tenure or job security, passports should be speaking out doubly. So that's how I thought about this.
Yeah, and I would say I would not recommend any of these actions to people who are not US citizens right now. Um, those actions were really for people who are citizens. But I understand completely, Vernita. And I think a lot of people, are scared for themselves. They're also scared for their groups. They're scared for, you know, uh, um, that if they speak out, maybe their university will get hit, and then it will hurt a lot of young people. Um, and I think these are all legitimate things to worry about. I think one thing that made a difference to me was an opinion piece written by Masha Gessen in the New York Times, where she talked about what was happening when Putin was consolidating his power in Russia. And people started getting scared and not speaking up. And and um, and they had all these reasons for not doing it. And then if you look at where they are today, what they were trying to prevent happened anyway. Um, that this editor was worried, well, if I publish this piece in my newspaper, then my newspaper will get closed down and all my journalists will everybody will lose their jobs. Well, the newspaper was closed down. It just happened a couple years later because when we are silent and don't stand up, that feeds the power of the administration. So it's tough. It's very tough. And I'm not I'm not saying that you should do something because um, you know, um, you're in a legitimately vulnerable position. Um, but I think it is sort of useful to keep that in mind. One book that I read recently that has helped bolster my resolve is it's Brave Genius by Sean Carroll, the biologist Sean Carroll. Um, it's a double biography of Albert Camus and Jacques Monod, and it talks about their work during the French Resistance. They put down everything. There were points when they just put down all their work and they devoted themselves to the French Resistance. And then other times they couldn't figure out what to do, so they went back to writing or doing science. It's a very inspiring book.
What's it called again, Andrea?
Brave Genius.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments they'd like to make? Yeah,
Curious.
Yes. So one thing that I don't know what to do about is lately I've noticed that that administration and Fox News and so on, they use some sort of pseudo-scientific language to kind of disguise, decision making as scientific to the general public. And then you talk to people who are supporter of that administration, and they say, "Oh, but it makes sense." And I find that very disturbing. And since I'm not very eloquent, so I don't really know exactly how to deal with this. And I'm wondering if there's a way to directly address that problem by having some sort of online column correcting the record continuously, systematically, or some other way like that. I just don't know. But I find that is very, very dangerous. Because basically it kind of it gives the impression to the general public that science is not really about being correct or not, or like the truth. It's about something else that's manipulated or like flexible.
Yeah, do y'all have any thoughts on that?
Well, this
Yeah.
is a bit like what do you say to the people who say that vaccines are bad for you? I mean, they've taken enormous body of research and effort and years of successes, and just claim it's not true. How do you reply to that? And I think it's kind of the same problem that you're raising.
Yeah, so one example, for example, the most recent one is what they say about peer review and how peer review should be maybe reorganized. And then they mention many of the things that we would agree, that it should be independent and so on. But at the end, they add that, somebody should have an overview. So it's, or like the vaccines, the same thing. They basically manipulate some part of the truth, but not all of it, so that it seems plausible. And that is super dangerous, I think. I find it.
Yeah, it is. I don't really have any useful
Yeah.
thing to say about how to combat it.
I will
Pardon?
just jump in to say one thing that so there's a subfield of political science on like political communications. And one of the things they're saying now is that one of the things that hasn't been very effective is when political elites tell people, "Oh, just pay attention to trust the experts, trust science, trust the experts," because they have their own experts that they trust, and so that if we can to the extent that you do want to go out and engage with the public to try to speak out for science that way. What I'm being told is that it's helpful to try to avoid into this trap of speaking down to others and instead to speak to values. So when you talk mechanistically, like, oh, trust the vaccine experts or trust this or trust that, that falls more flat than saying, look, as the scientific community holds these values, which is, we are independent seekers of truth and knowledge. We want to understand the world around us. We have an appreciation for complexity. We want to understand the world as it is, not necessarily as we wish it would be. That kind of message of speaking to values goes further. But I have to say that, there's probably a lot. Yeah, that's all I got.
Well, also, I think people really don't understand how science works. And sometimes instead of addressing a specific thing, just to talk about how the system of science works, how, if there were some dogma that that, you know, is not true and can be overturned, that's how people actually become famous. There is actually quite a bit of incentive to overturn established wisdom. Um, and so that's one thing. People think, like, you heard this a lot with climate, but you hear it now that, oh, this whole field of science, they're getting wealthy off of it's a conspiracy of bad science and they're all in it together because that's how they get wealthy. I mean, people don't understand we don't get wealthy off of our grants
Right.
at all, right? Right? I mean, there's so many things about how science works that people don't understand that maybe engaging them on how science works might might be more effective.
I'm
Uh,
just going to interrupt to call out some great comments happening in the comment
in
section.
the
So
chat,
Kelly
yeah.
Loud in the chat is
Yes.
saying that the American Physical Society has the Science Trust Project and a
Oh,
webinar
yeah.
that
How could I forget that? Yes.
specifically speaks on this issue and gives good guidance on how to
Yes.
speak to the public to foster trust. And Phil, I think your point about gold standard science is excellent. And then I thought Joey has this great question as an undergraduate. And
Science Trust Project.
Yeah, the Science Trust Project. Yeah, that's really important.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I clicked on the link during.
Should have remembered that.
That's great. No, that's good.
And it's
And
training people.
Advertisement for the Science Trust
You can
Project.
sign up to be trained on this. So there was somebody who asked if I'm an undergraduate, what can I do?
What
This
can
is
it,
one
yeah,
thing.
so what do we say to the undergraduate, Because my first inclination would be if you're an undergraduate, you fall into this category where your first responsibility is to learn how to be a great scientist, and don't sacrifice that. And then with whatever extra bandwidth you have, you can participate in these
But you
sorts
can
of,
protest.
you can protest.
You
Yeah,
can sign up for the APS Science Trust Project and get trained on how to talk to the public.
that's
And
right.
if you're an American citizen, you can contact Congress also. I mean, anyone over
Yes.
18 can call their Congress people.
Oh, yeah. There's this 5 calls app that I wanted to mention. You
Mhm.
download this app and then you put in your address and then
Oh, it
every day
generates.
you can just call. It'll just automatically give you the phone numbers to your congressional representative and
Yeah, that's great. And that actually brings up one thing I wanted to mention just about contacting representatives, because there were some misconceptions that I had previous to like even a few weeks ago, which is that if I live in Connecticut, and so I live in a blue state with Democratic representatives. But and so you might think, oh, they will already automatically agree with my stances, which is true, but they only have a certain number of things they can talk about. So even if you have Democratic representatives, calling them matters, because they literally take a tally, their staffers take a tally of what they hear about. And so if you want science to go up in their priority, then calling them matters, even if they agree with you. And this is particularly important right now because I mentioned briefly at the beginning that for example, this tax on endowments bill is their stated goal is to pass it by July 4th. So if you call your senators in particular, right, like literally in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it will have a large impact. And complaining about science funding and the tax on university endowments would be very helpful. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of contacting Congress people.
And I want to amplify Sid's excellent point about don't take the bait, right? One of the things we're seeing is there's that this administration has been very effective at finding wedge issues that divide us. And often, as very analytical and critical individuals, we can see opportunities for reform. Like, oh yeah, maybe there could be a better system for indirects, right? Or maybe there could be, there are many systems could be improved. Or maybe there are better ways to protect different minorities on campus and minority voices. But we have to recognize the broader assault here and set aside those impulses to reform or to divide. Be like, oh, this is only affecting Ivy League institutions, or only this is affecting only these institutions. This is not the time to relish in those divisions. This is the time to stand together, and one voice will be much more effective.
Yeah, we have a tendency to start hand-wringing. Oh yeah, we didn't do this perfectly. We didn't do that for no, this is not perfect. That's not perfect. And then to be guilty about these things that the administration is using against universities. And it's really important to realize that that's the tactic.
But I also just want to go back to Thierry's comment, because I think, to me, that's somehow the real nut that we have to crack, is how do we really begin to reshape science communication. And the one word, if I could get one word to be expunged from the English language, it'd be the word expert. Because every time I hear the word expert, I get upset by it. I can't imagine what other people feel about it, because you're told, oh, well, your opinions don't matter. There's an expert out there. And I have no idea who these people are. And it's somehow the other things that people here have been saying is that, well, but it's not that it's an expert, it's that this is what they were after in doing this, and this is the conclusions they came to from it. And and you can't just leave it to the this nebulous thing, and you have to, I think, be somewhat more concrete in trying to explain what the arguments are. And but we also have to learn how to communicate to people, because we're really bad at that.
One thing I did a few days ago is I sent an email to the local Rotary Club volunteering to give a talk about science and about what was happening to science right now. So I'm scheduled to do it in September.
Yeah, I think that's one of the best things we can do, is just try to get our faces and voices in front of non-academics more often. Just if anything, to humanize us, so they know that we make mistakes. We're just doing our best trying to figure out how the universe works. And yeah. But with that, I think we've run out of all of our time. This will be recorded and posted online on the, if you go to the DBIO webpage. So if you want to share it with any friends or anyone in your academic or non-academic networks, that might also be helpful. So I wanted to, thank you, Andy and Andrea and Sid, so much for joining us, and thank you to all the participants for joining and asking questions and involving yourself.
And thank you for organizing.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris.
And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Goodbye.